Next on Sisterhood of the Second Act.
People plan parties, weddings, and other important life events, but they often have a difficult time when it comes to planning the end of their lives. The Palliative Care Partnership of the Roanoke Valley works to empower people to plan and exercise their choices for palliative care and end-of-life care. And chances are you've heard of birth doulas and how they support the mother physically and emotionally throughout childbirth. Well, death doulas provide similar support, helping families navigate this inevitable transition, often leading to healing conversations between family members. Sharon Parker, Carilion Clinic Home Care and Hospice Clinical Program Manager, and Lisa Vineyard, a chaplain for Good Samaritan Hospice, join us today to help start this important conversation. We'll meet these women on this edition of Sisterhood of the Second Act right after this.
In Bedford County, Virginia, discover local wineries, breweries, cideries, and even a meadery. Each venue has its own unique vibe. Enjoy fun and games, or relax on a spacious deck with mountain views. Download the Bottled in Bedford Craft Beverage Trail map and sample happiness in every pour.
Get your map at bottledinbedford.com.
I'm going to be an oak tree.
I think I'll be a dogwood tree.
My kids said they'd be looking for a thorny tree for me.
With Evergreen, you can be a tree. Our biodegradable urn combines your ashes, natural soil additives, and a native tree of your choice. Be a tree and grow for tomorrow.
I want to be a tree.
Learn more at evergreenmemorialtrust.com.
Now from the Fox Radio Roanoke studios, this is Sisterhood of the Second Act. Welcome to Sisterhood of the Second Act. I'm Denise Allen Membrano. The Palliative Care Partnership of the Roanoke Valley has been working with healthcare professionals in geriatric training and education, as well as helping families with end-of-life planning since 2006. Sharon Parker, Carilion Clinic Home Care and Hospice Clinical Program Manager, as well as Lisa Vineyard, a chaplain with Good Samaritan Hospice, are both with the organization, and they're here to tell us more about the partnership. Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. Well, let's just jump right in. What is palliative care?
Well, palliative care is pain and symptom management that can be offered at any time during the course of an illness. We even see it in perinatal palliative care for babies that are diagnosed with conditions that are incongruent with life. And that can transcend into pediatric care, as well as we more so see it in the geriatric realm. So again, it's very much focused on comfort, but there can also be a curative element with palliative care as well.
And so how is it paid for? Everybody wants to know that question.
Palliative care is interesting in that most insurers will cover for this, and so it's not carved out as a special benefit like hospice care is.
And how is it different from hospice?
Well, hospice care is for individuals who are in a place where if their disease process were to continue, we would be looking at a 6 months or less time frame of life. And so it is something that, again, we have a wonderful team. Both of us, we are able to offer, and Roanoke is very blessed with wonderful hospice options that are just filled with interdisciplinary members. And Lisa is one of those members as a chaplain, and we have nurses and social workers and bereavement counselors and certified nursing assistants that are just probably, I was telling Lisa, we had an all-day conference for them this past Tuesday, and they truly play such pivotal roles in our hospice teams. And for many families who have been providing that hands-on care for a long time, to have someone who can come in and offer that bath, settle their loved one in very quickly, or maybe show them easier ways of doing things, it can be such a game changer for them.
And palliative care can be done in the hospital setting, it can be done in the home setting, or in a clinic setting.
Okay.
And hospice is also done in the hospital setting, but a lot of it's done in the homes as well as in nursing facilities.
Now, we are talking with Sharon Parker and Lisa Vineyard. They're with the Palliative Care Partnership of the Roanoke Valley about end-of-life care and the partnership itself. So what does the partnership do?
Well, the partnership came into existence 20 years ago, and it was really birthed out of a Ken Burns documentary on advanced care planning. And there were a number of very passionate individuals in the Valley that said, we need to do something. We need to educate individuals on how they can plan for end-of-life care, but also if there are unexpected circumstances that happen, tragedies that unfortunately we see accidents happen every day, and individuals are faced with these critical decisions, families are. And so advanced care planning is a way to give an individual a voice when they're no longer able to speak for themselves.
And that end-of-life talk is often difficult to have. Is that what pushed you all to develop this organization and keep you going? I mean, how do you encourage that conversation?
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's the Palliative Care Partnership is a way for many different organizations to partner together to help lift up the need to have the end-of-life conversation. I worked in the hospital setting for many years, and I could often tell when families had those conversations about what would mom or dad or my brother or my sister want at a time when decisions need to be made about how much aggressive care to do or how much comfort care to offer. And those families that had that conversation, sometimes it would happen in passing, sometimes it was much more formal and would be written down. But just having the conversation when it came to critical times of making decisions, those families could make them a little bit easier.
So the whole atmosphere surrounding that tragic situation, whatever, is different? Is that what you see?
Very much, very much so.
Well, that was kind of leading to my next question. Why is this conversation important to have? And also, if you could give some advice as to how to start that conversation.
Yes. There are some wonderful tools that can help individuals to start the conversation. The Conversation Project is one that we highly recommend, and it allows you to just, go to someone that you trust and say, there's just some things I'd like to talk about, or I'd like to plan more for my future, or I saw what happened to our friend Susan and how things played out with her at the end of life, and I don't want that for me. I want to have more of a voice in how my care is provided. So, different circumstances can kind of open the door to those conversations, but know that there are tools that can also help you. And those tools can start out by, if you were to receive a terminal diagnosis, would you want your healthcare providers to make those decisions for you? Or would you want a voice in that? And so it's kind of a 1 to 10 scale, and you rate yourself where you are. Because we know that how we feel about things can change as we experience things and we go through life, and we go through death with our loved ones and our friends. And the thing about advanced care planning, some individuals will say, well, if I complete an advanced directive or whatever, what if I changed my mind? Well, they can be updated. So that's just another piece of it. But yeah, just having those conversations and interjecting them, making it more of a normal part of what we talk about. But it can also be something as simple as, Denise, what does a good day look like for you? What brings you joy? What do you find as quality, in your life? Who provides you support when you're going through a hard time? Those are just some very, I call it just kind of easing into the pool, just kind of getting your feet wet in those conversations that can hopefully allow you to get into some deeper waters over time.
Yeah. what does it look, who should broach it? Should it be the kids of an adult? Should it be the adult? Who should start this conversation?
I think anybody who's willing to do it. This is really the reality, because sometimes the parent may be willing to do it. Sometimes it's the kid. Sometimes it's the grandchild. It's whoever can be willing to risk speaking up and acknowledging that life is important and we all will die someday. And how do we want that to look like? You know, my parents were never good at talking about end of life. I did it professionally every day of my life. And yet to do a formal sit down with my parents would have been very hard. So I would slip it in at those opportune moments. Oh, they're talking about so-and-so who died, or they're experiencing some health challenges, and be able to say, well, what's important? What would you like life to look like if certain things happen? So I think anyone can do it.
And we are talking with Sharon Parker and Lisa Vineyard from the Palliative Care Partnership of the Roanoke Valley. I know a lot of people, and Sharon and I have talked about this in the past, about how it's such a taboo subject in our culture, but it doesn't really have to be. Is that one thing your organization talks about?
Yes, and one of the things we did last year was we hosted a storyteller, because really we begin to know one another and what's important to ourselves when we share our stories. And so we had a national storyteller come as a part of an outreach, community outreach of Palliative Care Partnership of Roanoke Valley. Donald Davis came. And we followed that with a panel discussion. And he shared, I think it was 3 different stories about some wonderful relationships of people that he knew, but how those relationships played out at end of life, and just their experiences, the culture, their family relationships, how that all influenced that decision making at end of life. And I think it really spoke to the audience that it's as we share our stories and we know what's important to us, those are wonderful springboards to have these conversations. So we're planning to do something similar to that this year, October the 24th at the DeMoss Center. But we're going to focus more so this year on culture and experience and how that influences end-of-life decision-making. But the other part of what the Palliative Care Partnership is about is also the actual documents, making people aware of what is available for them to record, write down what is important to them.
And sometimes physicians will initiate those conversations, but I think oftentimes it can be really helpful if the person who's the patient, whether it's in an outpatient clinic at a regular physical, or if they're in a hospital setting, if the patient and family can help to articulate what's important to them, to the physician, it can often open up a door for much richer conversation about goals of care.
And those events that you talked about, I know you have videos. Those are on your website, and we'll have a link to your website in today's show notes at sisterhoodofthesecond-act.com. We're going to keep you all around. We're going to talk a little bit more about this conversation and switch gears a little bit and talk about death doulas, which people may not have heard of. So that coming up right after this.
In a region known for its beautiful mountain surroundings, our vibrant arts community makes the Allegheny Highlands a more colorful place to live and visit. Our passion for the arts is endless, and it's uniquely Allegheny.
I'm gonna be an oak tree.
I think I'll be a dogwood tree.
My kids say they be looking for a thorny tree for me.
With Evergreen, you can be a tree. Our biodegradable urn combines your ashes, natural soil additives, and a native tree of your choice. Be a tree and grow for tomorrow.
I want to be a tree.
Learn more at evergreenmemorialtrust.com.
In Bedford County, Virginia, discover local wineries, breweries, cideries, and even a meadery. Each venue has its own unique vibe. Enjoy fun and games, or relax on a spacious deck with mountain views. Download the Bottled in Bedford Craft Beverage Trail map and sample happiness in every pour.
Get your map at bottledinbedford.com.
Once again from the Fox Radio Roanoke Studios, Sisterhood of the Second Act.
Welcome back to Sisterhood of the Second Act. I'm Denise Allen Membrino. Death doulas may sound like a progressive idea, but throughout history in many cultures, they have provided spiritual, physical, and emotional support, as well as played a fundamental role in the transition to death. We are joined by Sharon Parker, Carilion Clinic Home Care and Hospice Clinical Program Manager, and Lisa Vineyard, a chaplain with Good Samaritan Hospice. And they've stayed with us this morning to talk more about death doulas and explain exactly what they do. And thank you for staying with us today. I think people have heard of birth doulas, but they may not have heard of death doulas. So what do they do, and how is it different than palliative care?
I think it's really a nice springboard to talk about, palliative care, pain and symptom management, hospice being that interprofessional group of caregivers that are providing very focused care at end of life. A death doula, and let me just step back and say that our latest statistics that we have is about 50% of Medicare beneficiaries elect to have hospice. A little less than 50%. And of those, 50% of them are on hospice for 18 days. 25%, 5 days. So that's a startling statistic. But oftentimes what happens is people are reticent to embrace hospice. We see this so often, but then families say, oh, I wish we had done this so much earlier, I think that the end-of-life doula is a complement to all that palliative and hospice care can provide. And people may be open to the concept of a end-of-life doula or death doula earlier than they may be to hospice. So I see an end-of-life doula as hopefully being a conduit, being that liaison, and helping to bridge that gap and say there are other resources as well. The other thing that I think that's happening, and Denise, you spoke about, this is not a new concept, but in the U.S., it is still a relatively new concept. In the last 5 to 10 years, it's really gained traction. And so there's still a lot of questions around what does the end-of-life doula do? And so that end-of-life doula may come in, and I have seen just a broad scope of services that individuals, when they hang their shingle out, say, this is what we do. And it can be anywhere from sitting vigil with someone as they're dying. It can be recording life stories. It could be memory making. It could also be just comforting the family. Maybe it's washing dishes, doing some task around the house. There are even end-of-life doulas who have a legal background, who help with the work that needs to be done and document that need to be finalized at end of life. So it's a pretty broad, or I should say, a myriad of options when we're looking at end of life doulas.
Now I know that is something that you do, correct?
And I have I started in the world of OB. And so with that, was very much drawn to doula work there. And I think what's important, there's so many parallels to birth and death. And that whole doula movement came about as two physicians by the name of Klaus and Kendall went down to Guatemala and were studying infant bonding. And there was an individual that would sit in the room and take notation. And what they found is that if the woman had that person in the room with them, they had decreased interventions, decreased cesarean births. They were breastfeeding, attaching more so quickly, and having enhanced parent-infant bonding. And they said, oh, there's something about this. Let's study this. And so thus came about that doula movement. And doula, or birth doula movement, and doula comes from the Greek word meaning bond servant. I'm attached to you. I'm here for you. And so as we see, that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So now we're 30 years along the way. So those women have aged. Some of them are facing their own mortality, but they're facing their parents' mortality. And they're also saying, okay, we were wanting to do birth differently then. We want to do death differently now. And so I believe that the end-of-life doula movement is changing how we perceive and approach death and dying.
I know you shared a really nice story about your own dad's death and just some steps you took. Can you explain that? Can you go over that again? Because I think that might help people understand how you can change the circumstances surrounding something that is inevitable.
My mother ended up dying in the home setting, the hospice, and she was all about family, and so we were all there in that setting. When my dad died, he died about 9 months after my mom did. And he ended up going to the hospital. He had experienced a heart attack, and he had a number of health issues. And he was very coherent at that time, but that was short-lived. And so within about 36 hours, he was no longer responsive. And so he was transferred to the palliative care unit. And Lisa's very familiar with that because she worked on that unit for a number of years. And while he was there were just a flock, I'll say a flock of people. My dad was a very social person, and so it was just like a revolving door of people that were coming in. And even though he wasn't responding at that time, they were just showering their love on him and on us and what he had meant to them. And after about, I guess, the second day of that, I went home and I went, this has been a wonderful time, but I just really feel like we need to shift gears a little bit, downshift. And so I just wrote a statement, and I can't remember verbatim, but it was thanking individuals for what they had meant to my father in his life. But now we were going through a time of transition, and so I just requested that they limit their visit and just allow that peace and just that that time of solace to happen. And I didn't want to offend anybody. I put that on the door of the glass door, the palliative care, and everybody was so receptive to that. And they came in, some sang, some just said a few words, and they left. And it was really that evening, and you could just feel the difference in the room. The energy was very different. But that evening, our immediate family, it was probably about 15 of us, were just gathered around his bed. And at one point, I got up and walked down the hall to the bathroom, and it's like I just saw this vision in my mind of this hot air balloon lifting, but it was just tethered, and it just couldn't fully lift. And I went back in the room, and I said, guys, actually, I went over to my dad before I said anything to the family. And I said, Dad, you have been an anchor for us. And I said, we are indebted to you for your love. I said, but I want you to know we're going to be okay. You've taught us well. We're going to move forward. And we all talked about, okay, now where are we in this? I think you're all tired. If you feel the need to just go home, And so it ended up being just my brother and myself. And my dad was starting skin changes, the modeling that we see in the extremities. And so I looked at my brother, and it was about maybe an hour had passed, if that much, once everyone left. And I said to my brother, I am about to pass out. If I don't have something in my system, I'm going to pass out. So I ran downstairs, got the quickest thing I could find. I came upstairs, and I was there maybe 5 minutes, and my dad passed. And I looked at my dad and I said, that is so like you. You always wanted to make sure I was fed. You always make sure I had that next meal, and you didn't leave until you were assured of that. And so, to me, it was just such a profound story of, one, just being open, being aware, but also being willing to step out and let others know what you perceive that individual would want at that time.
So go ahead.
And I would say, and that training as a doula helped you to be present in the midst of the transition, to be able to see, to be able to be aware, to respond. And I think that's one of the gifts that doulas have, the training to be present in those times of transition. And that transition can be a day, it can be a week, it can be months, but they're not afraid to go where many are hesitant or don't know how to go into those places of transition.
And they also help family members as well, like making that transition themselves, because it's a transition for family to be without this person, and in the grieving process. Is that correct? How do they help?
Well, oftentimes I look at it as anticipatory grief. You know, what can we do to make that time frame? So there's some proactive work that can be done. And some of that can be, how would we want the environment to look like at the time of death? And there are just some beautiful ways that we can honor that individual and bring the family in as well. So maybe there's music, maybe there are special readings, maybe we could have family members, you know, share those passages, whatever that may look like. Maybe there's having photos of loved ones who maybe can't be there, but to be in that room. Maybe there's just opening a window and just having that breeze. There are things that maybe they want, they say, I would like for these people to bathe me, you know. One of my very favorite stories is a woman, and I don't know her personally, the story was shared with me, a woman who was dying, and as she was, she would have individuals come in and write words on a scroll. And she had written out what she wanted at the time of death, and they had the candles and the music and so forth. And then she was bathed by those that she had requested, and they put on the blouse that she wanted. They covered her to her chest. And she said, now, I want you to take that scroll with all those words that were written to describe me and unfold from the top of my head to the soles of my feet. Because while I'm no longer here, those words carry on the essence of who I am. So what a gift to give to your family. And so as they think about that and they look back on that, that wasn't a traumatic event.
Right.
That was a shared experience.
So before we close today, how do people find a death doula if they want to include one in that situation?
There are many organizations, but I would just start by Googling end-of-life doulas in Virginia. You know, start there and then talk with people, interview them, see if they would be a good match for you.
And I would just want to add in that there are people who are not officially death doulas, but do help in that process at end of life. Working on the palliative care unit, we often used to say we were midwives to help our patients and their families through the dying process. So within the hospital system, there are people, nurses, physicians, chaplains, housekeepers sometimes, are folks who are willing to go there, as well as within hospices, there are folks who are willing to help folks in that dying process, in addition to official doulas who have been trained as doulas. There are many of us who walk with folks to help make end of life more meaningful and a little bit easier.
Thank you both for what you do, and thank you for being with us today. And we will have the Palliative Care Partnership's contact information in today's show notes at sisterhoodofthesecond.com. We'll be back to wrap up the show right after this.
In a region known for its beautiful mountain surroundings, our vibrant arts community makes the Allegheny Highlands a more colorful place to live and visit. Our passion for the arts is endless, and it's uniquely Allegheny.
I want to thank Sharon Parker and Lisa Vineyard for joining us today. You can learn more about the Palliative Care Partnership of the Roanoke Valley, as well as the role of death doulas, by going to today's show notes at sisterhoodofthesecond.com. I'm Denise Allen Membranio. We'll see you next week for another edition of Sisterhood of the Second Act.